Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution area of study 2. In this video, we will look at the 1921 famine and the subsequent peasant uprisings. So this makes up one of 3 videos on the crises of 1921 that led to a huge amount of change in Russia. So here is a quote from a peasant. This peasant said, "In our village, everyone eats human flesh, but they hide it. There are several cafeterias in the village, and all of them serve up young children." That just gives an indication to what life during the famine was like in the villages. So the key knowledge that we're going to cover in this video, we'll look at the challenges the new regime faced in attempting to consolidate its power, including the Civil War, because this all took place shortly after the Civil War, and it was as a direct result to the Civil War. We'll look at the changes and continuities in political, social, cultural, and economic conditions that influence leaders to compromise and or achieve their revolutionary ideals, including war communism and the 1921 famine, most importantly. And we'll look at the diverse revolutionary experiences of social groups and their responses to the challenges and changes to the conditions of everyday life, including peasants and workers. So that is the key knowledge that we will explore in this short video. So let's start by looking at the everyday impacts of the Civil War as a lead-in to the 1921 famine. So firstly, there were chronic shortages of food and fuel, as was the case with World War I, which brought down the Tsar. Food shortages were a serious threat. In terms of fuel, houses and fences were stripped of timber to burn in stoves because Russia is obviously incredibly cold and there was not enough fuel to heat people's houses. By 1920, most wages bought less than 2% of what they bought in 1914. So let's say in 1914, you could buy 100 chickens, let's just say, for a certain amount of money. In 1920, that same amount of money could only buy you 2 chickens. The prices of everyday goods had risen to 6,920 times their 1914 levels. So while wages bought less, one reason for that was because the price of everyday goods had gone up. As food shortages got worse, workers fled to rural areas in search of food. And 2 statistics that highlight this is by 1920, Petrograd's population had fallen by 70% and Moscow's had fallen by 50%. So that's like, Melbourne now has close to 5 million people. That's like Melbourne going in the space of 5-6 years, going from 5 million people and dropping down to like 2 million. In 1917, there were 2.6 million workers in Russia, and by 1920, this number had dropped to 1.2 million. So the working population had also halved, more than halved. The decrease in the workforce and in the availability of materials caused a dramatic decline in production as well. So large-scale industrial output fell to 13% of 1914 levels. Steel output was 4% of 1914 levels. Iron ore was at 1.5% of 1914 levels, and copper production had stopped entirely. That leads us into the 1921 famine. So by 1921, grain requisitioning and severe drought combined to produce a devastating famine. So that's why this relates to war communism, is because grain requisitioning was a significant policy of war communism. The amount of land under cultivation had dropped by 40%, and harvests were 37% of their 1914 levels. At least 20 million people were affected, either they died, they became incredibly sick, they were starving. or they had other people in their lives die. So at least 20 million people were affected, particularly in the Volga region and in Ukraine, Russia's breadbasket. With sanitation and rubbish collection declining, disease such as typhus and cholera caused millions of deaths. And overall, the 1921 famine caused at least 5 million deaths by starvation or disease. In terms of starvation, villagers of some regions ate famine bread. That was a very common meal to try and sustain themselves. And that famine bread was made of clay and grass. So not a whole lot of nutrients in famine bread. Thousands of cases of cannibalism were reported, just like that quote at the beginning. Millions of children were also orphaned or abandoned as they could not be fed. There were stories of parents having to tie up their children on opposite ends of the room to stop them from trying to eat each other. A lot of these children who were orphaned or abandoned turned to prostitution. So it had the famine had wide-reaching consequences in terms of social life in Russia and the social makeup of Russia. The Bolsheviks eventually and begrudgingly accepted aid from the American Relief Administration, the ARA. And by 1922, ARA soup kitchens were feeding 10 million Russians per day. So the Bolsheviks, having not really dealt with the West since coming into power, now had to accept aid from America. Now, the famine coincided with peasant uprisings. So peasant anger over grain requisitioning presented a significant challenge to the Bolsheviks. In 1921, 4.4 million peasant conscripts from the Red Army were demobilized from the Red Army as the war had ended in November 1920 and were sent home. Many rebelled after discovering the effect that war communism had had on their home villages while they had been at war. There were 50 major peasant uprisings in 1921. For example, the Tambov Revolt or the Tambov Uprising involved 50,000 rebels led by former SR Alexander Antonov. Antonov died in a shootout with Chekists in 1922. Now, these all presented significant challenges to the Bolsheviks. So their response was that Red Army and the Cheka were ordered to crush peasant rebellions. Ruthless tactics were used, including summary executions of suspected rebels and burning of entire villages. But grain requisitioning was abandoned. It was not necessary anymore. The famine had taken over in the countryside, and to try and appease some of this peasant anger, grain requisitioning was abandoned. The outcome of all of this, peasant rebellions were neutralized by late 1921, Bolshevik control was restored, and there was an increased pressure placed on the Bolsheviks to abandon unpopular policies of war communism, like grain requisitioning, which led to the introduction of the new economic policy, the NEP. And our next video, or the video, no, not our next video, the one after that, the third in this series on 1921, will talk in more detail about the new economic policy. So this has been a shorter than usual video, but I hope that you found it useful and interesting, and I will see you next time.